Right, okay, so we've been asked 3 questions. So why don't I read out the question, give a response, because I've been told I've got to go first, and then we can have a discussion from there, right?
Sure.
So the first one is looking at the general theme about uncertainty. I won't get into the VUCA nonsense and stuff like that, but it says, will digital sovereignty matter? If so, why? My general approach on that is yes, but I think it's missing the point. I think what actually matters is cognitive sovereignty, or what the feminists call epistemic justice. So it's the power of interpretation of data which matters, not the data itself. I mean, my colleague Beth, who's a fellow South Walian, has a wonderful way of explaining epistemic injustice. She says, old men are philosophers where the old wives tell tales. So the language you use describes the way it is, all right? And about 20 years ago, when I was in Washington with John Poindexter, and somebody asked, what do we think about AI? And this is 20 years ago. Both of us said simultaneously, the problem is the training data sets. And you can now see that if you've read the epistemic parrots, sorry, the brilliant paper, right? That Google has finally got round to realizing that that's one of the issues. So, and certainly a lot of our work is fundamentally allowing people to interpret their own experiences rather than having interpreted by black box AI or by experts. And the work we're doing on post-election peace and conflict resolution in the States at the moment is planned to use young children in schools and church groups as ethnographers into their communities, to identify the street stories, but to identify how they're interpreted by the people who tell them. And using that in photographic form, oral form, and artistic form, as well as textual form. Because what we can write down is about 10% of what we know. So I think the issue on digital stuff is actually how you source the data and how you interpret it. Yeah, if we're going to make a change. So that would be my general response on that one.
Well, I noticed when I read the question, the way my mind actually my mental hand started to work its way around it. I think I shifted it to say something like sovereignty in the context of the digital, and sort of reorienting the focus on the primary question: what does it even mean to speak about sovereignty? And as I thought about that, and in the context of the digital, holding that in the background, I noticed sort of 3 characteristics that seem to be at least fundamentally part of any notion of this question: what does it mean when we say sovereignty? One was very much the Viktor Frankl direction, the interiority, the particularities of the capacity of the individual to make effective choices on their own basis. Because there's a whole bunch of stuff to be done there. We can do things like stop training people to not think, or create emulation structures where people are getting in their own way. There's a wide variety of stuff we could talk about there. Or the opposite, we could actually be effective in helping people learn how to increasingly be able to navigate the world on the basis of their own cognitive capacity. Then the second one had to do with something like relationality. So this problem of digital sovereignty, oftentimes high asymmetry in relationality steps into the front. So as we talked about, Forrest and I actually, in the context of a question that Tristan Harris asked us, something like Facebook is particularly challenging in the context of sovereignty, principally because of the enormous asymmetry of the relationship. I am standing on one side of the line, and a gigantic multinational corporation employing tens of thousands of people and billions of dollars, and AIs that are training against all the data that the world can provide, is on the other side of the line. And it's sort of implausible in principle for there to be anything like kind of integrity of relationship, which is to say that my capacity to actually steward my own choices is implausible, and I will always be on my heels with regard to something like Facebook. So the second piece of the context of sovereignty in the context of the digital is really rethinking the possibilities of how do we reshape the sort of the architecture dynamic of relationality towards more and more either always orienting towards symmetry of relationship, or creating structures where asymmetry is present, there's a big thumb on the scale of the quote unquote little guy. And then the third had to do with something like the notion of architectures or structures. And some of the things that you were mentioning, I think, fit into that category for me.
Yeah, and I go a bit beyond that. I think part of the problem is, and I think most of computer-based technology grew off two basic assumptions about human cognition, which we know are wrong. One was social atomism, the assumption the individual is prime, entire unto themselves. Yeah. Mm. And the other was an information processing model. Now, if we look at the work of Andy Clark and others, we know that consciousness is distributed, it's embedded, it's embodied, it's enacted. So it's a distributed function of our brain, our bodies, and our social interactions. And that actually can't be mimicked by computers at the moment. So the danger for me is not that we're not different, but that we might dumb ourselves down to the level of computer processing, which is what I think people like Facebook want us to do. Right. Facebook want to reduce agency in actors and cluster them together. Right? So I think one of the big things is how, and I think there's 3 A's on this, there's agency, affordance, and assemblage. And I think those are the sort of 3 things you need to map. So what level of agency do actors have in the system? Yeah. Yep. And actors can be collective, not just individual. So I say we found if you use children as ethnographers, particularly around puberty, they can get data that computers can't, and you're starting to get this collective interaction or sense making. And we've done work there with transgenerational pairs where we put young people with old people to come up with social interventions. Yeah? In fact, I'm talking about that with Tyson, who wrote Sand Talk in a couple of weeks' time, because we're looking at that in the indigenous concepts. That's a big one you and I are doing together. So I think that concept of realizing that consciousness is, yeah, it's a small world. It all comes together eventually. Right?
I just imagine you're 2 of the more garrulous individuals I've met.
Oh, we're enjoying it. He's a fan of Kevin. We've enjoyed ourselves on the preparation. We're going to have a ball, right? And you have to remember that I'm Welsh. So my grandmother was beaten up by English teachers if she spoke Welsh in school. So we've got that right? It's Wales is England's first and hopefully will be its last colony. We're working on that, right? So I think that concept of embedded, embodied, enacted, of distributed consciousness, and I think that's key, right? Because if you can assert that, the asymmetry changes, because the algorithms can't handle that level of social interaction. So one of the big things we're looking at the moment is peer-to-peer knowledge flow. So you want to remove mediation from knowledge flow between actors. Now that changes the affordances available to people because they can discover things they wouldn't otherwise discover. And Facebook tries to prevent you discovering things it doesn't want you to discover. And then assemblages, which is, Deleuze's great contribution to thinking, and more people should study it. Right? Delander is brilliant on Deleuze. Is the patterns of multiple narratives over time act like attractor mechanisms that we can't escape. So one of the things, again, we've been looking at is Deleuze's concept of lines of flight. So how do you find the weaknesses in the attractor mechanism and bring people's attention to them so they can find escapes? Yeah. And my gut feel is kind of like, I don't think Facebook is the big enemy anymore. I think people have started to understand how it works. And you've got a new generation coming through. There's whole groups of people now who don't spend their time online. They go to festivals. They're breaking that pattern, all right? Right. And Facebook is old paradigm, it won't adjust. I think there are different forms of social media, which interestingly are non-text based, which are picking up more. So and I think IT has a 30 to 50 year lifespan before it dies and gets replaced. If you look on technology. So I think we've got a bit of that going on at the moment. But yeah, it comes a bit onto the second question is how do you educate people? Yeah. Yeah. I think the trouble is people aren't aware. I mean, one of the things I've done with people is I've got a couple of personalities I maintain in Facebook, one of which is a right-wing one. All right. And if I put a query in on that, I get completely different results than if I put my only one in. All right. Because what Facebook is trying to do is cluster light with light to make them more attractive for advertisers. I mean, that's the obvious goal on that. But I think human beings are getting a bit more savvy on that. And there's more and more peer-to-peer systems coming into play. We have a neighborhood scheme, for example, which is software, but it's entirely peer-to-peer between members of the village and the surrounding villages and the surrounding towns. There's no mediation on it. It's a simple peer-to-peer flow type system.
Yeah, so there's, I'm noticing the second question actually begins to step up into the space. So I feel like maybe if we shift there, open that one up, and then actually expand the sphere to hold both 1 and 2 into the same place, some interesting things will happen.
Yeah, I think technology may help us here. I mean, I've been walking the last 2 days, and you shouldn't walk 30 miles at the age of 67 in a heat wave without adequate water. So I'm still recovering from that, right? But if I look at the amount of technology, and I left my phone charger behind me on day one when I left the car at the car park to go back later. I was stopping in a pub, and it was like, I can't function. Because, you know, my iPhone has got my maps, it's got my time, it's got the bus times to get back, it's got all of those sort of things. The iWatch is keeping my pace up and everything like that. So technology has become interesting. I think this is the Internet of Things, as it used to be called. It's got different names now. Is when technology becomes pervasive, so we don't think about it when we use it, it actually has more utility. Yeah. It's the old way thing. It's kind of like becoming a tool. And if you pick up a hammer and it fits your hand, it's a tool. If you have to buy or re-engineer your hand to fit the tool, something's going wrong.
Yeah.
And I think some of the more recent technology, Facebook requires you to re-engineer the way you think socially to interact with it. Yeah. And I said once, all right, which I'll repeat, I think you've heard me say this, that the part of the problem is most technology is devised by anally retentive 30-year-old misogynists in California who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty.
30, you're giving him a 3-year grade of maturity.
They're building systems, yeah, based on that sort of approach. It's like things like holacracy, which is a truly disastrous form of bureaucracy. But it's a computer programmer who doesn't want to exercise human judgment, writing a system so he won't have to do it. Yeah. And I think, you know, one of the big issues at the moment is judgment and social interaction. And I say the peace and reconciliation when we're working is transgenerational, localized. Find things which are common to red and blue, get them to work on them together. Don't talk about the problem. Yeah.
Right.
So
now, and I'm actually now feeling Tyson being part of the conversation. So one picture, many of the things that are coming up in the way that you're framing it is, how'd you call it? Like, so if you imagine the transition from indigenous to agricultural as a big rock dropped into the pool of Homo sapiens in the context of the ecosystem of life, and as the ripples of that particular event cascade out and then hit and come back and cascade in and create a wide variety of different artifacts, not the least of which is things like mass migrations and weaponization, arms race conflicts, and a wide, the escalation and movement of domestication of people in general, the orientation and conversion of males into warriors and females into domesticated breeders, etc. Like all of these artifacts that spread. And part of what we're witnessing right now is a process of simultaneously a equilibrium process where there is not a reinforcement of a ripple against the more steady state environment. It will tend to work its way out over time. Of course, there are also reinforcements. We have to be mindful of that. And then a consciousness process, to the degree to which we can actually be aware of what's happening, we can at the very least stop reinforcing the stuff that we'd like to have evaporate and maybe make small steps in the direction of the things that we feel are more in alignment with long-term sustainability.
And I think that's one of the big switches. I'm just writing a blog post. I've decided it's about time to do an all-out attack on Peter Senge. All right, on the basis that Fifth Discipline was inspirational when I read it in the 80s, but you now read it with the benefit of hindsight. You think, oh my God, did we really take this stuff seriously? Because it's like most stuff that you see in systems thinking. It starts off, it defines what you shouldn't do. Then it defines individual human behavior, which is considered desirable. Then it runs workshops by which everybody agrees to be good. And we've been doing that for 30 years and nothing has changed. So it's kind of like, let's talk in order to act. Now, if I go back to the original work I did on knowledge, which was ironically in Kakadu in the 70s, when I was in the World Council of Churches, so I was working on Aboriginal land rights. Yeah. One of the key things which came out of that work, which we practiced ever since, is you do in order to have a conversation. So you don't, and this is the peace and reconciliation approach. You don't get everybody together to have a conversation in a room. I mean, that's what they tried to do in Coromila in Northern Ireland, and it was wonderfully satirized in, I don't know whether you've seen the Derry Girls.
Yeah.
Okay, it's, I'll put the link in. it's a wonderfully satirical channel 4 comedy series about a bunch of teenage girls growing up in Derry during the Troubles. So the background is the Troubles, but it's ordinary lives. And in episode 1 of series 2, which you've got there, they bring the Catholic girls together with the Protestant boys in a peace and reconciliation process. And it's hysterically funny, right? But it makes the point. You can all, in a workshop, everybody can agree that they want to behave differently, which is what systems thinking is dependent on. But then they just go back to doing things they did before, and nothing changes. When I was working on that at the same period, we took 2 Catholics and 1 Protestant, or 2 Protestants and 1 Catholic, and dumped them into Latin America for 6 months. And we didn't talk about the Troubles. So that sort of doing in order to have a conversation, I think, is one of the key switches we need.
I think this strikes too. So this is I think really nice. I think there's a bunch of fundamental things that come out of basically the same set of, I guess you might call them principles or insights. One would be something like, be conscious of the fact of a mania towards system style, complicated system control.
Yeah.
Okay. Be conscious of that as a mania. 1, stop being a maniac. Slow down. Don't continue to double down on that. Rather allow it.
A white liberal professor educated in MIT who thinks if everybody was like him, the world would be a better place. I mean, there's a cultural imperialism in this as well.
Well, it's even stronger than, well, yes, the word culture there is specific, right? Because that poor boy who grew up to be that body was imperialized first and foremost by a phenomenon, a standing wave, an egregore, a word that I like, that has been fluctuating around for quite some time.
And we got the epigenetics as well, so we know the biological mechanism of cultural inheritance, and that makes it more scary because we're actually RNA passing through cultural patterns into our children and grandchildren.
Right, for a long time. So it's going to be a while. So that's the second, right?
Yeah.
So the first would be something like really acknowledge the degree to which this is like a lineage story. This is a grandchildren and great-grandchildren story. Okay, that means you're not going to solve the problem in a week. Right? You're not going to instantiate a new bureaucracy that's going to use systems thinking to control it in the next fortnight. No, it's going to be a process. It's going to take a while. It'll soften, it'll shift, it'll move, and there'll be a noticing of it getting better, and it'll take a while. So just allow it to take the time it needs to take, which is a reorientation towards a more natural approach.
And it's localization. I mean, I think part of the problem with climate change stuff, all right? So, I mean, the latest report which came out, even good friends of mine said they were stopping watching the news anymore because they decided they couldn't do anything about climate change. It was all a disaster. We're all doomed, so we might as well make hay while the sun shines, right?
Right.
Now, the trouble is that sort of what you see on every climate change initiative is people are trying to solve the big problem. What they're not doing is small scale interventions to increase the options. I mean, this is a basic principle of complexity decision making. In a crisis, you focus on increasing options so you've got time to think.
Mm-hmm.
So initiatives like, for example, refreezing the poles, which would give us 30 years more breathing space, is now an engineering problem, not a scientific problem, but everybody's focused on carbon targets, which are not going to happen. Yeah.
Right.
So, and we need to make climate change proximate to people's lives. Now it's happening anyway because of the disasters. But until people see, there's a lovely book, you may have read it, by Terry Eagleton called Radical Sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and another book, Hope Without Optimism, which is a brilliant. You've got to get to the point where people, and that's reassessing Moltmann's work. So I've been going back to Moltmann based on that. And I knew Terry when we were both editors of a Catholic Marxist journal back in the 70s, so that's going back some. But the basic principle is you have to get people into small sacrifices in their proximate environment. So the dispositional state changes so they'll accept politicians wanting to make wider sacrifices as a whole. But you don't start with the global change. You've got to start with that localization, realization of the need for change. And we've got to accelerate that process. Yeah.
And so we start having some, recurs back to the points that I was making in the beginning. There's something like, something having to do with something like symmetry or scale. So more choices made at the human scale level. And as much as possible, and I think that a lot of the movements that are going right now in an area that I'm spending a lot of time on, the thing that's known as the blockchain or decentralization, has to do with simultaneously taking power, taking energy away from the kind of the mid-century systems theory oriented regulatory structures and actually structurally moving that so that the choice making is actually in fact embedded in local.
I think it is, but I think we're not paying sufficient attention to the control at that level. I think the danger with blockchain is it becomes a libertarian wet dream, right? And that won't work, right? So I think the issue is distributed nodal control rather than distributed individual control.
I think that's already happening, actually.
Yeah.
I think there's
that's
a reason why.
Yeah. So, and it's the old thing. I was talking with briefly with Robin Dunbar the other day on the Stoa, right?
Oh, nice.
And you know, it was interesting because I've always argued that 5 million was the maximum size a country could get to and maintain cultural cohesion. And he sort of, I mentioned that, and he confirmed he's now got evidence to support that.
Interesting.
Okay. There's mathematical evidence to back that up. So 5 million goes with 500, with 150, with 15. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where we move into, we need to start to think about identities, not individuals, and we need to think about agency at identity level.
This is where,
to be honest, commercially in marketing, that's more important. I mean, what Facebook is trying to do is to force us into a predefined set of categories rather than a sort of fluidity of normal human identity structures.
So Deleuze comes back here, right? The shift from the individual to the divisual, and the shift to assemblages, right? As multiple different fluid styles of identity that have distinct agency in particular context. And then the other move we have, which is clearly happening and will continue to happen because it's part of the kind of a low energy structure, is the Chinese style social credit system, which is doing the same thing, but from a different orienting basis.
Yeah, they were quite scary in some ways. I mean, it was quite interesting. One of the big studies we did for Poindexter when I was working with DARPA is we looked at the collapse of empires.
Oh, nice.
So we looked at the Roman Empire, the English Empire, the American Empire, and the Chinese Empire. And we had to abandon the Chinese one. I mean, the Roman, the English, and the American are in common. They actually, and America hasn't met this yet, Rome and England break when they realize people don't want to be Romans and don't want to be English. And you know, it's the Indian Mutiny for England. It's various "Where are my eagles?" So it hasn't. We thought it might be Iraq for the Americans, but it hasn't. Yeah, but the Chinese don't worry about that. They just let the barbarians conquer them. Then their educational system makes them Chinese, and that's what they've been doing with capitalism. The same with Singapore. I mean, Singapore and Chinese are state capitalists. They actually have a very high degree of social provision and social care. Both of them are better prepared for global warming than anybody else is in the world at the moment. I mean, China is interested in Afghanistan, not to control it politically, but to secure its rare earths. Yeah, and that's been their strategy. So I think, you know, I'm not saying it's desirable, but they have collectivist structures. Yeah, that's why I think Singapore is actually quite interesting because it's a voluntary collective structure. In terms of the way it works.
Singapore is extremely interesting. Singapore is one of the things that I think needs to be studied very closely. My sense of the Chinese empire is that it collapses for the same reason that every Chinese empire collapses, which is that they are an obligate mandarinate. And that means that they ultimately will always orient towards the complicated control systems, which will have a collapse.
They do have a history of relaxing. If they know they're going to lose, they actually concede before then they're seen to lose.
This is all, their collapse is always an interior, not an exterior.
That's fine. It's always an interior dynamic, all right? So I think it's fascinating. As I say, Singapore is a more interesting example because it's absorbed aspects of democracy into the system. But they still,
people, yeah.
But they still have a sort of collective consciousness about the way they work and a level of social interaction and social dependency, which we started to lose. It was interesting. I did a whole bunch of ethnography about 10 years back in Tea Party communities in the States. And I remember going back to DC and saying, look, these guys are socialists. If you look at their day-to-day practice, they're really strong community. They look after each other. Yeah, they respect each other. They don't like outsiders, but fundamentally they operate a localized socialist economy. And you're getting them wrong because you're not understanding what their value system is. Yeah. I mean, hillbilly energy sort of partly hit that, but not completely. Sure. So I think that there are models of collective interaction I mean, it's like when I see Mary Boone, who I wrote the Harvard article with, she always makes me go to church in Connecticut. And I mean, it's a social gathering. I mean, the preacher will say something terrible about the Israelis and pro-Palestinian, and they'll sing a few hymns just to pretend they're really religious. And then they sort out everything they need to do in the community. And actually, that's what the Catholic Church used to be like in Ireland. It was a place where people got together every Sunday and sorted out the community aspects. And so I think there are models we can draw on here. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about that at the level of architecture. So in the first question, digital sovereignty in the context of the digital, the creation or regeneration of ordinary rituals and institutional structures that support human communal relationships.
Yeah, and we talk about a concept called coherent heterogeneity.
Yeah.
So what you actually see in most of, say, the peace and reconciliation work is, and this is the sort of white liberal thing, it's a homogenization. If everybody was like us, life would be better. So the way I normally illustrate it is, Friday night, I'm going down to watch a rugby match, where Cardiff are playing Bath, right? So my team are Cardiff, we play in blue and black. We're very intelligent players. We never break the rules. We're very respectful of the referee, and generally we're put upon by evil teams like those bastards from Llanelli, who actually cheat and foul and can't be trusted. But when the English arrive, we're Welsh.
Yeah.
So what you've got is heterogeneity, which can be coherent at different levels.
Sure.
And I think that's what we need to start to look for in the structure of society, because different people are coming from different places. So you need that ability. This is the old sort of, clan to tribe to horde type concept, which again is supported by Robin stuff.
Yeah, and Tyson, right? These names, these things are starting to come. I think it's like it's coming out in the wash. I think the basic structures are showing it to be invariant. So it's things like when I walk around my neighborhood in a Southern California suburb, it's obviously a desert. Right? There's almost not even weak bond relationality. I've literally lived here for 4 years. I have a child and a dog. I go for a walk at least twice a day. And I think I know 4 of my neighbors at all.
Yeah.
Nothing. So we have to go beyond weak bond all the way back into something like strong bond and that proper verticality, right? All the way up to 5 million with the right kind of geometry. And that's actually the work. You do that, and then the digital stuff becomes vastly less important in the story.
There's an interesting new form emerging. So I don't know where you got in the States, but in the UK, because people can't afford housing, what you're starting to see is families coming together to buy a bigger house and live in it communally with separation.
Oh yeah.
So, and value in that, because it means you have more diversity in your social interactions. It's more like the extended clan. And I think, that's what come back to Singapore, what they've done brilliantly with their housing development is everybody gets housing. But if your income increases, you have to move up. So they have racial quotas on housing blocks, but housing blocks are within economic bands. So you're meeting people from completely different color skins from you, but they're in the same income group and you have the same sort of shops and the same sort of schools. So they don't have that obvious disparity. And that was a brilliant bit of social engineering by Lee Kuan Yew. Because actually Singapore has the highest rate of interracial marriage in the world. And that interracial marriage is one of the great taboos. New Zealand has slightly more, but that's the Maori Pākehā thing, but Singapore has diversity.
I just had the insight of this problem of the epigenetic transmission and the degree to which cross lineage marriage may actually serve as a way to accelerate the processing of epigenetic transmission. In fact, it would have to by nature.
Yeah, and Jablonka's got some interesting stuff on that. She just wrote a new book on the epigenetics of empathy.
Don't know it.
Jablonka wrote one of the defining ones on epigenetics. I mean, she's a controversial figure, which makes her fun anyway. She's an Israeli geneticist. Famously said very publicly, no geneticist has ever taken Richard Dawkins seriously or ever will. Which is probably true, right? So she identified, interestingly, the way that the level of language, the sophistication of the language you speak, actually has an epigenetic effect on your children.
Really?
Yeah, it's in a book, right? It's really worth reading. Now that has really significant implications. Think about it, because it means she also identified the way, for example, if you have 2 or 3 generations of unemployment and lack of education, then obesity is a biological problem, not a sociological. logical problem. Yeah.
So the way my mind is popping the metaphor of that is fluid dynamics and things like salinity density, and what you just described, the relation between language, culture, and epigenetics. The epigenetics, of course, is a more viscous medium, but there's a higher degree of translation between the two than I expected.
There's an interesting link on that. One of the big things I've been working on now for about 7 years, and I'm finally putting out into public, is I've been working with Constructor Theory, which came out of Deutsch's work in Cambridge, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The Constructor Theory basically says you identify a counterfactual universe. So we do that by constraint mapping. So you map the constraints available, that tells you what isn't possible, but then you can look at the constraints to say, if I relax the constraint, could I change it?
Yeah.
Then within that structure, you try and create constructors. Now, this is not the same thing as constructional law, which I think is problematic because it implies flow. Yeah. Constructors are low energy replicators. Yeah. So one of the key principles of constructor theory is whatever has the lowest energy gradient will happen.
Mm-hmm.
So that means if you want good things to happen, you've got to make the energy cost of being good lower than the energy cost of being bad. And you can actually use that as a predictive mechanism about what will happen to society or companies or cultures. And so we're doing a lot of work on that at the moment to create mapping techniques and constructor experiments, yeah, to look at replicability. And I think what plans do for humans is they ensure replicability of outcome. Yeah, because they allow for multiple roles, yeah, within context.
Yeah, so there's a Levee metaphor in the context of digital sovereignty that comes up, right? So the model that we've been operating under for quite some time, at least during my entire lifetime, was one that tried to not follow that principle of constructor theory by saying instead, let's build dikes and levees, hold back bad behavior, but in fact, actually make it be a lower energy level. And of course, what you get is you get a short term that works for a little while. And so you think you're okay. And by the time you've actually lost conscious awareness of what you've done, then the system actually begins to route around, degrade, and break through those levees. But you've actually created a frozen accident in your structure where you've embedded a deeper layer of fundamental structure that is like incentive landscapes that are allowed to run willy-nilly inside levees. And that's a very challenging thing to flush through.
And the metaphor I've used for that is the difference between a seawall and a salt marsh. So a seawall is a robust system. Yeah, it's fine as long as it doesn't exceed its design conditions, but when it breaks, it's catastrophic. Whereas a salt marsh, I mean, my definition of resilience, which by the way got me blocked by Taleb, but I'm one of many people blocked by Taleb. Yeah. It's an honorable group, right? Which basically said a resilient system is one which survives with continuity of identity over time. And anti-fragile is just one way to achieve that and not the most effective. Yeah, it's not that different. Yeah. So that argument is if a salt marsh gets saturated, it doesn't release its water when it goes over that. And I think that's the metaphor we're looking for society. And I think that's where constructors come in, because they actually create predictable structures which can change over time, which is, by the way, the Cynefin concept. I've been chatting with Tyson about that. This Cynefin doesn't mean habitat or place. It means it's a sense of continuous flow and change over time, but with continuity. Turns out there's about 15 different indigenous words in Australia, which are the equivalent. So we're going to have that debate when we get on the law.
I've been doing this in Hawaii with the Hawaiians and have exactly the same conversation where I'll say something and somebody on the other side will say, hold on. They'll say the whole thing in Hawaiian and go, okay, and then we'll move.
Yeah, it was actually it's a side chat. Somebody on the other day tried to beat me up on social media for using a Welsh word for a model, which they said was unpronounceable. And I checked their website and it was full of Kanban and Kaizen and stuff like that. So I said, well, kind of like, you're saturated with Japanese words, yeah, which you obviously don't understand. So I think one Welsh word is permitted. But I think the point is you do need different language to express new concepts.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of the indigenous stuff, because there are a lot of words in indigenous language, like words like Cynefin or Hiriaeth in Welsh is another one, yeah, which you just can't translate.
Right. Well, there's an implicit assumption, a contextual given in the indigenous of continuity.
Yeah.
And if that's not part of your basic grammar, you can't actually recover that through any number of definitions.
And it's not just indigenous, it's most of Latin America and Africa and Asia as well. It's the commutarian social atomistic divide.
Yeah.
I refuse West and Eastern anymore. What you're talking about is different in Northern Europe and North America and the rest of the world. Yeah, and the trouble is that's the dominant culture, and that's the dominant culture from the technology. China's mixed. China's mixed. I mean, it depends whether you're in the Tao. I mean, I think one of the great strengths of China is the Taoism-Confucian tension.
There you go. Yeah.
I mean, it's perfect. They got both of them operating, interacting with each other continuously. All right.
Always my response when people talk to me about China is right now too much Confucius.
Yeah, and
no
not
doubt.
Tao. Yeah.
Otherwise, go. That's the.
I'd also make a potentially controversial statement that when Taoism went east and became Buddhism, it got damaged in the process. And when it went west, and when it went further west and got adopted by American management gurus, it disappeared completely up its own rear end. I call that faux.
I can't even imagine what that would even look like. Well, I guess I can. It would be marketed. The Tao that can be marketed is not the Tao.
Yeah, but I think it's not surprising a lot of people in complexity science get interested in Taoism. Because it does understand that concept of emergence and heuristics and what I've called necessary ambiguity. If you remove ambiguity from the system, you destroy its ability to evolve. Yeah. I mean, if you take sort of the Buddhist direction, if you make the mistake, it's like if you drink the pill and think, oh, to not say is to destroy agency altogether, then you're in trouble. But that's not what the point is. The point is there's an aspect of agency that is intrinsically of the mode of not saying. And there's a whole bunch of stuff you've got to be able to have. Like your body doesn't care about what it is you're saying. There's a huge amount of agency. The vast majority of agency in the world has nothing to do with saying. Learn that agency, embody that agency, notice that agency is intrinsically has continuity as part of it, then allowing the saying piece to be part of the story as well. Yeah, and I extended, Polanyi famously said, we always know more than we can say. And I extended that saying we can always say more than we can write down. And again, I think that's the problem with digitization. Digitization is focused on what we can write down.
I was going to say the opposite. I was noticing, actually, I mean, we have this cultural move away from writing down towards things like this.
Yeah, and also to pictures on Instagram and stuff like that. But you're still, it's quite interesting. I mean, I've had 2 years without getting on a plane and without speaking to an audience, which is driving me quietly insane. I haven't been with my wife for this long in our entire married life. And we've kind of like survived it, right? But you know that, for example, smell is a major factor in human trust decisions, and you don't get that virtually.
Yeah.
So I think one of the dangers is the reduction of human stimulation, which again comes back to this hyperlocalization. Fascinatingly, when in lockdown in our village, where we had a bit of the Californian problem because everybody lives in detached houses and gets into London, but then all of a sudden we're in lockdown and there was this sort of clap for the NHS thing going on. So we all ended up taking drinks outside and then everybody wanted to carry on. So our street ended up with everybody on deck chairs, socially distanced with drinks, having conversations in a way that we've never done before.
Yep.
And that really built the village. And I think that comes back to my point about communal living rather than atomistic living, which I think is coming back in. Yeah.
Yeah. So my sense, I'm continuing to hold the kind of the prompts in the back of my mind. There's something like a whole wisdom of how we properly do things that Dave has been spending a lifetime on, collaborating with lots of people on, and articulating clearly. So lots of that. 2, really noticing, for example, when big changes show up, like the lockdowns, how that affords us a possibility of escaping things like inertia or unconsciousness or poorly designed incentive structures into being able to apply these principles, whether that's intentionally or not. Then 3, something like it's so funny, I'm just seeing now the mental image of safe to fail probes in this process of upregulation, but a more like this. Okay, did we like the notion of us all sitting on our lawn chairs and carrying on in person in the village? Nice. Can we find a way to use that to actually do more like that? And then 4 is something about recognizing and stepping away from the mania, which is a natural mania, right? The control systems of the mid-century can't possibly do the thing that they were set out to do, but they can't escape from doubling down on what they are. So there's going to be a problem. There's going to be some trouble as they explode into mania until we can release them from their requirements and allow that stuff to settle back into a much broader system.
We talked about that as vector theory of change, which says you identify experiences and say we want more of experiences like this and fewer experiences like that.
Yeah.
You effectively, it's a descriptive shift. You don't say we want to be more community-based because that's evaluative.
Yep.
And again, I think that's the difference between complexity thinking and systems thinking is we're shifting into those. How do you, I mean, this to my mind is where nudge economics needs to be, not where it is, because where it is deeply manipulative, right?
Oh, yeah.
But if you can identify when a system is ready to change, which is your point about observation, and if you can then enable people to achieve that change locally, and you can share that knowledge horizontally, you get there. Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, some of this links in with the final question as well, which is this lifelong learning thing. And I think, I mean, there's 2 really negative things happening at the moment. One is in Australia, which is being replicated in the UK at the moment, which is quite dangerous. So, I mean, we've always had relatively free education, all right? So when I went to university, all my fees were paid for and the government paid me to live and, you know, I could get drunk on the state, right? My children have to pay fees, but they're still low, right? But what they're now doing is saying, if you want to do STEM subjects, you will get very low fees. But if you want to study the humanities, the fees will be treble. And that's a 19th century model of education. So you're saying, we will educate you to, you know, learn how to program computers. So we'll give you a job for 5 years until we replace you with the next generation coming out who are bright, you know, better educated. And only the elite will ever learn about philosophy and art, you know, anthropology and everything else. And that's a really disturbing trend. I think the other really disturbing trend is the anti-intellectualism that you see in North America and to some extent Northern Europe, in that people don't want to read difficult books. So it's like the whole management textbook phenomenon. So, I mean, I've told this story before. Don Tapstock put myself and Mary in touch with his book agent, right? So we phone up the agent and talk about the book. And he said, oh, no, this is far too complicated. You've got too much stuff in it. That's not what I want. And we said, what do you mean? He said, what I want is one new book every 2 years with a catchy title, lots of cases, which claims to be truly original. And then we'll make money on your speaker fees. And I suddenly looked and I thought, that's Taleb, that's Denny. Yeah, and you look at it, that's what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
Is, you know, the idea of in-depth study. Yeah. Well, we had somebody, I've got somebody on Facebook at the moment who in 2008 got blocked on Wikipedia. And so now he believes the whole of Wikipedia is a conspiracy to attack people like him. And he just doesn't believe the evidence, all right? He hasn't investigated it. He basically did the classic academic mistake of saying he was an expert, therefore his edit should be accepted and everybody else should be ignored. So he got blocked. But what's fascinating is once he believes something, and this is somebody on the left progressively, he's exhibiting exactly the same behavior as Trump supporters. You know, I have a belief system, so the facts must fit the belief system, and I don't understand the process of questioning the facts or looking at evidence. So it's interesting, when I was at primary school, we were taught comprehension. And I don't think they teach that anymore. We had to take, you know, 2 or 3 pages and summarize it. We had to understand what the text meant. And what you see is people picking up off key words and key phrases and then saying, this supports me. Yeah.
The way that the way I tell the story is that there's a little bit of a Joseph Tainter, a little bit of some other things that once you've locked in, again, I mean, it's, what's this, the other guy's name? When you created a metric, the moment you create the metric, it's no longer a valid metric, Gresham?
That's Strathern's variation on Goodhart's law.
Goodhart's law, there we go, thank you. In the educational system, it starts in some context, usually after some kind of real change, and it has a certain vitality to it. But then it begins the process of sort of entropically playing out its structural axiomatics into some particular low energy state.
Yeah, and And I think part of the problem, though, is it's not a both-and solution. So again, I was having an argument with somebody who says that all schools are prisons and factories, and they're not. So, for example, all right, we know cognitively, if you learn a poem every week around about the age of 8 to 10, your brain develops hugely. Okay? But you probably wouldn't volunteer to do it at the age of 8 to 10 because kind of like you have to be made to do it, all right? We had to debate every week. You know, we didn't know what we were speaking on. We walked to the front of the class, we'd be given a card, it told us emotion, and we just had to speak without preparation. So all of that stuff, you know, was kind of like a formal system, which made us more equipped to be generalists. In effect, you didn't know what you read. And equally, we then started to volunteer. So I think, you know, and I was saying this the other day, you know, Obama needs to know that impoverished, this is when he was putting the thing in place. If you don't have basic literacy levels in all American cities, you've got a problem because you've got disempowerment and disenfranchisement. So I think we've got to find the right balance here. We've got to have a balance between sort of freedom, expression, and learning, and a balance between things that people need to do and standards that we need to measure. And we're not, yeah, that's where we've got to go, is that balance mix.
This speaks to the third question, which I would say is, I think if you grasp it, it's fundamental, primary, which is something like lifelong learning implies also lifelong teaching, which is to say that you have to actually move that notion of learningness as a competence, like the meta competence, learning how to learn, as the developmental center. And then everything else rotates off of that axis Monday, recognizing that you can't move the agency, you can't move the sovereignty of that out of, right? There's instruments and institutions. I'm going to use that distinction. There are definitely instruments, like I can go to a martial arts instructor and they have teacherly authority and they have competence and capacity that my friend down the street doesn't have. Great. And by virtue of doing that, I can more effectively upgrade my competence in this particular thing. But that martial arts instructor, if they're good at what they do, they truly are a master in the sense of mastery, know that what they're really doing is imbuing in me a discipline and an orientation towards what it takes for me to actually be a master in general, perhaps a master in their discipline, right? So that level of sensibility around commitment at the center, I think, is the key to any P2P infrastructure.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I can't understand why a lot of my academic colleagues think that they shouldn't teach. Because actually teaching is one of the ways you educate yourself.
Right.
And I think it's this qualities v process thing. So for example, if I take my debating case, so, you know, every week we stood up and we had to speak for 7 minutes without preparation or something. What that meant is we read newspapers, we read everything we could read, but you didn't know what you were going to get hit. So we became journalists. Nobody taught us to be journalists. There was a competitive process which made us journalists. Yeah. And I think that's one of the issues, all right, is how do you, and that's a type of affordance. Because you can't teach everything that people need to learn. It's coming back to your point about silence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They could never do so.
Yeah.
So I had a conversation with a young man about maybe 2 weeks ago, who is really an expert in extreme stuff. Like I think he holds the world's record for slacklining, several kilometers of slacklining, which frankly blows my mind. One of the things that he is quite focused on is competitive paragliding. And he had a beautiful metaphor in competitive paragliding. They have a term called the Gaggle. And the Gaggle is a functional, like a little bit like the Peloton, right? A standing wave in local choice making, where to be in the Peloton is the only way to actually have the entropic capacity to be participating in winning the race. And so the Peloton's a natural standing wave in that choice making. The Gaggle is even more fascinating because the way the Gaggle works is that to be able to actually read the signals of, for example, the thermal movement of air, the best signal is every other racer.
Yeah.
So it's not as simple as a Peloton, but to find the pocket of energy in this extremely complex system, you have to actually begin to orient towards the choices that every other flyer is making, which means that you begin to notice that you are actually operating as a single distributed cognition entity with a collaboration manifold on the outside and a competitive manifold on the inside. And people who participate notice that if you try to give yourself local selective advantage past a certain threshold, you drop out of the gaggle, which then creates a catastrophic drop in your actual competitive nature. So you have to be in the gaggle first and then competing inside the gaggle second. That's what I feel like in your debate club.
That's really interesting. I mean, we spent about a year and a half working on a complexity-based approach to design thinking. And Anne Pendleton-Julian, who wrote a brilliant book with John Seeley Brown recently on design, was one of the people I worked with on that. And we started to play around with creating a typology of scaffolding. So we worked on that in Whistler and then in Wales. Yeah. And one of the scaffolding types we came up with is effectively what we call dark scaffolding, of which the best is, and that's a reference to dark energy in cosmology, i.e. you can see the effect of something, but you can't recreate it.
Yeah. And
we used extreme sports as an example of that, because you can't create an extreme sport overnight. It's got to evolve. Yeah, the sort of things you've talked about evolve through practice. The technology evolves through practice. You know, differently. I mean, my hobby is walking, right? If I look at the technology I'm walking with now compared with the technology I walked with 50 years ago, it's just incredibly different, right? But you couldn't have designed that up front. It's a complex evolutionary process and the social practices which go with it. Now, I think what we're missing, this comes back to the education point, is being intellectually curious is actually not respectable. So where I come from in Wales, there are two mining traditions, the north and the south. Yeah. So the north was slate mining, the south was coal mining. What was fascinating is both of them, because they were generally teetotal and chapel, emphasized education. So if you go into the slate mines in North Wales, there are hollowed out rooms in the slate mine called caban. And during their meal breaks, they get together and discuss politics or religion and keep minutes, and the minute books are still there. And the South Wales miners created the miners' libraries and created the workers' education movement and hired lecturers to come and lecture them on Marxism and socialism, so that they were educated, and that was completely respectable in a working class community. What was then interesting is the educational system then siphoned everybody out. So the communities lost it, all right? So we've lost that concept of education as a part of day-to-day life. And I've met people who say, well, I've left school now, why should I read another book? And you think, oh my God, where do I go?
Well, the whole thing, right? Because not only there's like an embedded sense, like you have this deep, quite unconscious sense of the disgruntled schoolboy. The notion of reading a book is attached to being forced to do something over a long enough period of time that it's clearly not part of good work. You didn't get the feedback that told you, oh yeah, like the poem. If you get the feedback at some point where the poem was worth it, then your system is like, oh, okay, I get it. I've just built capacity for learning.
You get these silly dichotomies. I mean, when I was school, I was captain of debates, but I was also captain of rugby. And I won the chair for a poem, right? And that was just considered normal. Is why would you separate sports from academic life? Because actually, if you've got an academic brain, you're probably better at sports anyway, particularly if you have a brain. You know what the referee thinks, all right?
Yeah, you got a brain and you got a body. They probably are part of the same thing.
But so, I think that's a social norm, all right? So I think we're reducing the affordances available to people by these sort of fairly primitive dichotomies.
So then let me just throw one thing out that came to me. Yeah, when you were talking about, I can't remember the phrase you used, but it was the notion of more of this and less of this. Because there was an iterative process there, and a key part of the iterative process, I'm sure it's already part of the language, but I just want to bring it up here, is that notion of transformation. Notion of we intrinsically must participate in the transformative process that it is orienting. You can't have
the key issue, all right, it's interesting, is if you don't know, I wrote this European Union field guide on complexity management, which has just come out in paper form. And you know, we had 4 stages in this, which is assess, adapt, accept, transcend. The critical thing is said transcendence is an emergent property of doing things. It's not something you say you're going to do up front. So you have to engage in the process of transcendence, but you don't define transcendence.
Oh, for sure. But think about the distinction between that and the nudge theory in economics.
No, don't.
The most important thing to Cass Sunstein is that he doesn't change. He stays the same, and he changes things outside of him. To do this thing, you've got to be part of the we, and you must be willing to change and to transcend as part of what's happening. You must be willing to transcend, and as you say, and now it's because you're actually doing it. But before you even know it, you've already changed.
It's interesting. I had an argument with a nudge unit in Whitehall. Yeah, this is David Halpin et al. And I said, look, we've got a mechanism by which we can use children as ethnographers. We can map the narrative space and we can identify when society is ready to be nudged. And then we can trigger transgenerational pairs, young people working with old people, to initiate nudges and give you feedback. And he said, no, that's not what it's about. He said, the government tell me what they want to achieve and I achieve it.
Mm-hmm.
I said, you guys aren't nudging, you're yanking.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah, it's deeply manipulative. Yeah,
Deep.
effectively. Yeah, there's a wonderful book called Neuroliberalism by colleagues of mine at Aberystwyth University. They're basically saying what's happening with behavioral economics is they've subordinated cognitive neuroscience to the needs of neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a very nice way of just describing where we are right now.
Yeah. And I say that sort of manipulation is problematic. Yeah. Okay, John's been very silent. John, we're on the hour, so what do you want us to talk about that we haven't talked about or bring up? We've rambled around a bit as we tend to do. If you'd had Forrest here, it would have been even worse.
Well, this hostless briefed format was obviously an experiment. And we reached out to two people who care more about sense making and thinking rather than what their peers think of themselves. But I must thank you again on behalf of the group for actually taking part in this experiment. So quickly, some feedback. The tempo and the flow made it, for me, compulsive viewing. A rough analogy to software, for me, it was kind of multi-threaded, which breaks my double speed watching of YouTube videos. So two people.
I still wish we'd had a video on Powder Mountain, which went on to Dan's house, which went on to Forrest's house. That was one hell of a 10-day period, that was it.
Yeah.
So I'm a software engineer by training, and I actually think software or engineers are good at complexity. But you touched on this earlier, Dave, that engineers need to be more conversant with sense making. So the content like this, which is so, it was multi-threaded. I need to go back and revisit lots of things. There's things I recognize that you said, Dave, but there's things that Jordan brought up, which I think, I need to investigate that. And one thing that stuck in my mind was lifelong learning implies lifelong teaching. I think there's a lot.
I argued in an ITEL book, which was just published. I wrote an article, which is unusual for ITEL. I said no software engineer should be allowed on a computer without training in ethics.
Yeah.
Because everything they do has ethical implications, and they just haven't got the frameworks to understand the implications of what they're doing.
Well, I obviously need to listen to the group, but I think, in my opinion, this has been a success in going some way to be able to achieve that compelling viewing that's free to anybody who's got the time to listen. So what would be useful is for the community is feedback on the way we've gone about this. I've explained how I feel, but I'm not so sure on how you felt it was. Was it any use? Could we have done better? Is the format really not as good as I'm perceiving it to be? And the last point I'm going to make is I have an agenda here, and that is to make myself redundant in the community. So if you were to say, well, one thing you need to do is get rid of that John Grant. You need a charismatic person in the slot who can guide the conversation. Because when that happens, other people will come forward and try to find other Jordan Halls that could have conversations either with yourself or with Sonia or with Jules, and just keep this ticking over, because sense making, anthro-complexity, that is the reason I got in touch with Jordan, because I think he's done that journey from lawyer to successful entrepreneur to thinking about civium complexity and the importance of sense making.
The only thing I'd throw in, Jordan's probably got more than this, but we've actually found that 3 people having a conversation is easier than 2 people having a conversation. Yeah. It means people, somebody can sit and not say anything while there's something going on. So it's like that. There's that trio concept that we've been developing for informal networks. And it's what we got in the triopticon, which is the expert dispute resolution. 3 people talking is a balance. Yeah.
The conversation moves to the center when there's 3 people,
Yeah.
which is nice. That would be a very good kind of a change or shift.
It was interesting on Powder Mountain because there was Forrest, myself, and that Marxist from Harvard. What was his name? Brilliant guy. Oh God, I've forgotten his name now. But either way, the point is that he could interrogate Forrest on something, which gave me breathing space, which you need in a conversation with Forrest to think about what I was going to say next, and vice versa. So that sort of balancing thing works a bit. Yeah.
So John, in that context, if you had 3, I hate to say it, but the role that you play would actually be more crucial, because unless the 3 were already able to very quickly come to something like coherence, you'd have a period of time where the conversation is sort of looking for its center. But if you could actually help it find its center earlier, which is what you're doing by creating like a structured prompt that says, okay, here's the context. Okay, simplify the conversation. So you can simplify the conversation, providing a context that then allows the 3, or in our case, the 2, to sort of say, okay, of the infinite number of things that we could talk about, here's the subset that we're going to begin with. And that holds it in a space that makes it able to be a conversation faster, I think. So that's cool. So you can sort of step back and be not in the conversation, but by supporting the context of the conversation, make it easier and faster for it to be able to kind of be generative quickly.
If you look at the big ones we did around COVID, I mean, we had that one webinar where we had 2,000 people, which I've never had before. And that was Alicia Gerraro, myself, and Pendleton Julian. So it was a heavyweight academic discussion. And people, there's a growing appetite for that.
Mm.
Yeah.
One of the pieces I'd like to throw in there, John, was the way that you sent the invitation had an aesthetic that, again, really reinforced the notion of the context. I don't know if you were conscious or how conscious you were of it, but the structure of the invitation was extremely consent-based. And so you proposed a model. You then inquired as to my consent and the degree to which that consent was very like, yes, yes, yes to this. And like anything else, you can't help it. The sub rosa of that provides a lot of what's happening. Like I know what I'm getting into because of just the way the invitation is structured. So just to be mindful of that as well. The who, the how, the what.
Well, this is brilliant feedback, and I think it will inspire others, hopefully, to reach out to others.
When you broadcast. It'd be interesting to see what questions come out of the community.
Of course, yeah. All right, guys, I'm gonna go play with my little one.
Cool. And I shall go and put something in the oven quickly.
Yeah, get some food.